Ooh, you look so freaked out right now. Now I suggest you listen very carefully. Subscribe to ClassHorrorCast, or I'll gut you like a fish. Enjoy the show. I'll be watching.
Welcome back to another episode of ClassHorrorCast. I'm your host Aran, and on this week's show I'm joined by the one and only master of horror, Mr.Mick Garris. From a young age, Mick was engrossed in film and the filmmaking process, which led him to work as a freelance critic for a number of different publications. In 1977 he was hired as a receptionist for the newly formed Star Wars Corporation, which led him to making many industry contacts and saw him host his own interview program, chatting with the likes of Steven Speilberg, Christopher Lee and many more. Through hard work and relationships that he had formed, Mick got hired by Spielberg as a writer and story editor for Amazing Stories, which would change his life and see him contribute to many projects such as The Fly Part 2, Psycho 4, Sleepwalkers and The Mummy remake. Mick also played a huge role in creating the most iconic Halloween film of all time, with 1993's Hocus Pocus, and in 2005 he was the driving force behind the Masters of Horror series. Someone who many consider the godfather of podcasting, especially within the genre, Mick hosts his uber successful show, Postmortem with Mick Garris. Mick is both extremely passionate and knowledgeable about film and its processes. We chat about his unfortunate health scare and how it affected him, his lifelong passion and drive for his craft, the exciting future he has planned, and some other unique and wonderful stories. Join me as I dive inside the mind of one of the masters of horror, Mr. Mick Garris. So Mick, can you remember your gateway into horror, or maybe earliest memories of a movie or a show that kind of started to capture your imagination?
Yeah, the first one for me, I remember it very well. It was Son of Kong. And I was maybe 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old, something like that. And my mother had seen King Kong, the original, in the theater in a reissue when she was a tiny child. Mm-hmm. And it terrified her, and she peed in her dad's lap in the cinema. So she wanted to make it a very nutritious experience for us, and nothing so terrifying as the one she went through. It was on television, and I'm one of four kids, three later, but four Garris kids. So we were all together in the living room, father and mother there, making sure everybody was comfortable. And it turns out that Son of Kong is really more of a comedy than it is a horror movie. But I was taken by this creature. You know, the stop motion gorilla was quite amazing to me. I knew it wasn't real because of stop motion, especially in the earliest days, had such a herky-jerky feel to it, but I was fascinated by it. And it was this giant creature and fighting other giant creatures and interacting with people. And I was quite entranced by that. And so from then, it was all television. With the Universal classics, you know, everybody at that time, people, gray-haired people my age, that was their baptism into the genre. And then I saw the original Psycho in the drive-in with my family in a station wagon in the San Fernando Valley here in Los Angeles. And so that was my first horror movie experience in a theater, even though it was outside in a car.
Yeah. And would you say at that point then, I know some people have those experiences and maybe, you know, they get terrified by a movie and kind of stray away from that stuff. Did that just draw you in?
No, it opened a door.
Yeah.
And, it's like giving a child sugar for the first time. My eyes lit up, everything glowed. And it was like, wow, there's this. And I just fell into it and loved it. And it's very, very rarely that I was ever scared by a horror movie, even as the youngest of children. Yeah.
And do you find from that young age, obviously you've penned a lot of incredible stories and created these worlds. Is that something that's always kind of been inside of you, I guess, as a teen and growing up? Did you always have this imagination? Yeah,
my father had trained as an artist, and he was very talented and very skillful, but he never was able to make a living at it. I don't think he ever sold a painting or did any artwork for money, but he was extremely accomplished. So I was lucky enough to share some of that. Mm-hmm. But when it came to storytelling, I'd read everything Ray Bradbury had written by the time I was 12 years old, and I just ate it up. Fantasy, horror, science fiction, when I was a child, not the quality stuff. It was the ace doubles where there was one crappy sci-fi novel on one side, you turn it over, there's another one on the other side. But it was, I never fell away from it. I felt a kindred spirit in this. And most people in their youth, when they're drawn to the genre, it's because they feel like outsiders. And it wasn't until decades later when they started having conventions. And, in 1959, they started Famous Monsters magazine. And I realized, as a child, there are other people who care about this stuff besides me, because nobody in my school, none of my friends, none of my relatives, none of them were into horror movies. And I always was the odd man out, but particularly when it came to cinematic entertainment.
And, later on in life, so you become a freelance critic for a lot of different publications and different things. When you got involved in that, was the intention always to maybe end up on the other side of those interviews and those pieces of content? Did you always want to be the creator, the filmmaker?
I wanted to, but I never imagined it would be possible. I was from a very working class family. I was lucky enough to go to college and all of that. But it was junior college and state college that did not require much financial investment. Mm-hmm. But I started writing when I was 12, and I was really into it and I loved it. And I never dared to imagine that I could do that for a living. And then in my late teens, I joined a band, a progressive rock band that was an all original band. And I was a singer and songwriter there. And that made me think about the possibility of maybe I'd become a rock star, and that would enable me to write screenplays and get them produced. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I was writing that I thought, gee, maybe I could be a director. And having begun a successful screenwriting career, within a year or two, I was directing.
And was it a natural progression for you, to go from these things? I think at one point you worked as a receptionist for for the Star Wars company at the time. I want to say you were a host for different I can't remember.
The Z Channel show.
The Z Channel show. And was that all like a natural progression, and then into doing the making of documentaries and things? Did that happen organically, or was it something like, did you have to kind of fight to get yourself where you wanted to be?
Well, the first step was the toughest. I started writing reviews for the Z Channel. The Z Channel was the first pay TV channel in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. So they ran 2 movies a week, and they reran them constantly, just like a movie theater would. And so I wrote for their magazine. Then I proposed to the editor of the magazine, who was also the programmer of the Z Channel, that we take a genre film every now and then, and that I would interview the maker of that film. So I had been interviewing since I was 12 years old for my high school. Well, actually, no, from high school, probably when I was 15 years old. Mm-hmm. And I had interviewed Ray Bradbury and Rod Serling, and then I got into music and interviewed Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, all these people. So the interviewing led me into a world where I could interview filmmakers. And that was what opened up the door. I had the idea to do this show. The program director said, that sounds like a good idea. Give me a list of movies and we'll see what we can get for you to start with. And the first one we got was Zardoz. Mm-hmm. And so I managed, because it was in Los Angeles and everybody had the Z Channel who was working in the industry. This cable company was based in an area where a lot of the upscale people in the film industry lived. They saw the show and they were willing to be on it. John Borman was my first guest, but it worked up to getting Christopher Lee and Steven Spielberg and that sort of thing. So interviewing Steven really was a big door opener because he really enjoyed doing the interview, and it's not something he always liked to do. So when they were making the second Indiana Jones movie, Frank Marshall was directing the making of documentary, and Steven asked if I could interview him for the documentary. And so I did that, and then I started doing specialized publicity because nobody really knew the genre and knew marketing and publicity, and it was something I was learning about doing. So I was hired at Avco Embassy to do specialized marketing for The Fog originally, and that led to The Howling and Escape from New York. And so I was at the right place at the right time. So from doing the Z Channel show, for which I was paid the princely sum of $100 per show, that opened doors to jobs in the film community where I got to know people. And the first one to hire me as a screenwriter, I was making the documentary on the making of The Goonies on the first day of shooting. And I was interviewing Steven, who had been on my Z Channel show. And he said, wow, you must do a lot of these. And I was foolish enough to say, well, I'm trying to put all of my attention into screenwriting. And he says, oh, you're a writer. Well, we're looking for writers for my new show, Amazing Stories. And at the time, I'd had an agent, and the agent actually had given a sample script to the Amazing Stories staff. And they read it and recommended it. So that timing was fortuitous, and it became my first screenwriting job was Steven Spielberg hiring me for Amazing Stories because he liked me as an interviewer and an enthusiastic fan and student of film. And then his people gave me affirmation as the last sentence in their coverage of my spec screenplay was hire this man. So Steven read it and liked it, and I was the first writer hired for Amazing Stories.
Is that something, obviously, talent and skill and passion really has to come into all this as well. I don't think people would make it in those situations if not. But do you think maybe the willingness to put yourself out there to actually be in those positions has a lot to do with that? I find people get frozen maybe because the first question I was going to ask is, at that point, is there like any nerves that take you over being like, I'm sitting here with Steven Spielberg, I'm here with all these incredible people. And I feel like some people get frozen by that. Yeah.
I was petrified, when I first got the call that Steven Spielberg was calling my home and my wife Cynthia was in the other room. Is that Steven Spielberg calling for Mick Garris? This is Mick. Hold, please. I'm going, Cynthia, Steven Spielberg. It's very intimidating. Yeah. But you not only have to be, ambition can be a double-edged sword. It can make you really obnoxious. It can make you an intolerable person, or it can drive you to achieve, and achieving through your work rather than achieving through using people as stepping stones. And in this case, just as important as your work and your ability to do what people are looking for, it's also being somebody people want to work with. There are plenty of really talented people who I don't want to work with because they're obnoxious or, they have egos that get in the way of the work or whatever. But there are at least as many really great people who are just as talented, if not more so. And that's a big part of it. And it's been a big part of what I do as a filmmaker is I want to be a collaborator. I want to be somebody who not only people want to work with, but want to give their best to as a director, to be somebody who works through encouragement and all that. But your question was about the intimidation factor. And yeah, it's absolutely. Every time I work with somebody I respect and admire, I'm cowed by it, as an interviewer particularly. But now that I've got decades of a career under my belt, it's a lot easier to do my own podcast and interview people who are extremely accomplished. Many of them, if not most of them, are friends of mine beforehand, but a lot of them aren't. And it's easy to be cowed by that.
Yeah.
I mean, what about you? You do the same thing.
That was kind of why I picked your brain, because I feel a little bit of that right now.
Oh God, I'm easy.
And it's just one of those things. And I knew that, and from different people in the community and anyone that maybe in circles that I've been in that have had any interaction with you, it's always been the same feedback. I guess just for me, it's like, it's that thing of, similar to what I said about, oh my God, it's Steven Spielberg. It's like, to me, it's like, oh my God, it's Mick Garris.
They're two different ballparks entirely.
There's something that I think though, right? A lot of people, know you for your role in a lot of these iconic IPs and timeless movies. Something I think that you don't get enough credit for though is, I would consider when you actually really break it down and go back, and you had said that you've been interviewing basically since you were about 15, 16 years old. For you to be interviewing the likes of Steven Spielberg all the way back then, I would consider you one of the godfathers really of podcasts in many ways, because you've kind of...
That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, and because you've really... And it's like you've pivoted with the times, with things like Masters of Horror. It was really of the time, and it was...
Thank you.
It was like new and trendy, and then as things changed, you kind of were able to change with it, if that makes sense. Sometimes I find, somebody who's had a long career, they kind of just stick to this one thing, and you've been able to kind of move with the times.
A lot of people, kind of stay where they are, they calcify, and they can be successful on the terms in which they met their success originally. Mm-hmm. But for me, I've always got to be excited by it. Yeah. And I always am. Every time I embark on something new, I want it to be something new. The worst thing a screenwriter or a filmmaker can do is attempt to do what is popular right now, because it's not going to be popular by the time you make your project. Yeah. Masters of Horror, nobody had ever done that before, where you give the keys to the asylum to the lunatics themselves and let them make what they want to make. But that's the only way you get them. That's the only way television will get Tobe Hooper and John Carpenter and, mm-hmm. Dante and Takashi Miike and Dario Argento. And we did something nobody had ever done before. And so that's a high mark for me, having started on Amazing Stories. What an amazing high mark. I had scripts that were produced by Steven Spielberg, and they were directed by Bob Zemeckis and Joe Dante and people who I really, really admired. So you have to be excited. And I feel like a shark that never wants to be still. Mm-hmm. If you are still, you die. And I always want to be evolving. Technology and popular culture are constantly evolving. The movies that I like are constantly evolving. I know people who only like movies that were made in the 1970s and before. And there's still a lot of good stuff out there. Maybe it's harder to find because in the cinemas, all you're seeing are the giant franchises. But thanks to streaming, we still have the opportunity to find movies that are distinctive and original and go places we haven't been before. And that's the excitement of working in the cinema.
And just to touch on your podcast, Postmortem, is that something that you see yourself continuing to do?
As long as we keep having interesting people, you know, we very rarely have repeat guests. We do it occasionally for a special occasion, or maybe a movie's coming out or whatever. But, you know, we are now in our 6th year. And I don't know. Will this be the last year? It depends. You know, for the last couple of years, I thought, oh, we're never going to be able to keep maintaining the quality of guests that we have. You know, sometimes it'll be guests you've never heard of who have work that I really like and think other people should be aware of. And other times, you know, we have Guillermo del Toro or Clive Barker or Stephen King. But every year I think, we're not going to get those names anymore. And should I keep doing this? And we'll see. You know, I have 2 I'm creating right now that we'll see what happens with them in a feature film that I've written to produce. And if those things kick into high gear, then it'll be harder to maintain this schedule. But as far as I'm concerned, it gives me great pleasure to do this. Sharing time with my friends, figuring out how people operate, what makes them tick, learning about people about whom I know nothing, you know, other than their work. And directors don't work together unless you have them come in to do a cameo as an actor or something. So it's fascinating to me to constantly be learning. And I'm not bullshitting when I say I learned something I never had on this show.
Yeah, and I think that really shines through to the audience as well. At least for myself, I can kind of find that you're actually genuinely interested. It isn't just, you know, like you said, it isn't just, okay, this guy's got a movie coming out in next month. Let's interview him and like play the game of like, oh, wow, you know, this movie. And while some people enjoy that, I just find that and I think you're in a unique position as well where you can bring people, let's say, you know, there's times where I find myself enjoying the episodes where I don't know the person as well, nearly more than, you know, if you've got like Stephen King. I'm like, oh, I enjoyed this as much as I thought I would have enjoyed Clive Barker or all these different people.
Yeah, I love getting excited about something like the movie Revenge and Coralie Fargia, the French director. I saw that movie, it knocked me out, and I tracked her down and we did it via Zoom. She was in Paris, I was in LA. And, you know, now she's doing a big Hollywood studio movie next that just announced this week. But I love people like that who have a movie that you really need to see and you really want to see, but you've never heard of it before. Yeah. We don't do it that often. You know, if you do 5 of those in a row, you find your listenership drops when you don't have the Guillermo del Toros and the Walter Hills and the Tom Savinis and the like. And all of those, you know, I learned something from those too, but I learned from Coralie how she makes movies and her perspective, and, you know, really came out of the gate with a really accomplished, fantastic film.
Do you think that that's something that's given you this fantastic career that you've been able to have, is maybe your curiosity, your, I guess you're striving to learn something from everybody and you can kind of take something from everything?
I would like to think all artists think that way, but maybe that's not true. But it has certainly maintained my enthusiasm for it. You know, I'll go a few years without actually making something, but I'll always be working on projects. And being a writer, I've written a ton of scripts that have never been bought or made, but I do them, and I'm lucky enough that I don't have to sell them. A lot of people go out to the studios and they'll pitch a project, and then if they sell the project, then they'll write it. I'd much rather just sit down and write something I care about, I'm passionate about, and if they buy it, fantastic. And if they don't, what's a few of honing my craft and getting better at what I do, whether I sell it or not. So it does keep me excited. Meeting new filmmakers whose films excite me, keep me enthusiastic and keep my belief in the medium strong, because it's easy to get disillusioned if you just look at what's playing in the cinemas. But film going has changed. We consume our our movies and television very differently. And now television has become a place where you get really offbeat and intelligent and complex stories that you never could get other than in a cinema. But now you can get a series from Spain, like 30 Coins from Alex de la Iglesia. I don't know if you've seen that, but here's something you never would have been able to see, and it's on HBO here in the States.
Yeah.
And you can access something that is profoundly original and captivating and scary and sexy and artistic as hell that you're not going to get in the cinema.
Yeah, I think that's the flip side. Really interesting to hear you have that take, actually. With you having such a long career, a lot of people, I guess, are against, this streaming and this modern day movie experience. A lot of people see negatives from it, and while I do agree that maybe sometimes there's such a huge push on all these different projects, and today you're Netflix's biggest thing, and tomorrow you're nobody again and you're forgotten about. Yeah. and I do get that, but I definitely think that anything that's worthwhile does find its audience.
Hopefully it does, but there's not really much choice. I'd much rather see any movie in a cinema where God intended.
Yeah.
But because it doesn't offer the kinds of choices that it used to in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, if your alternative is Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or Apple or whatever, I've got an 86-inch 4K TV with surround sound, and I try to replicate the film experience as much as possible.
Yeah, and I don't know what made me think of this, but I would probably kick myself if I didn't bring this up, and I know you've probably heard this a million times. Hocus Pocus is what I would consider, well, it's in my top 5 favorite movies of all time. I have seen that movie probably more times than any other movie.
More times than me, probably.
And I will say, and a lot of people, not just me, would consider that like the pinnacle of a Halloween movie, and I think it's been immortalized, since it's come out as the most popular, the most beloved Halloween movie of all time. And I don't think that's going to change. Amazing? How does that make you feel to, without making it sound egotistical, that's something that'll never be, like, long after all of us are gone, that can never be washed away?
Well, it makes me feel humble, and it makes me feel proud at the same time. I didn't make it on my own. There were 11 other writers on it after me, but they ended up going back to virtually what I'd written in the first couple of drafts of the screenplay. But the idea that you've made something that, there's merchandise in every Halloween store that you go to and online, all of that stuff that's out there that wouldn't be there if David Kirshner hadn't come up with the idea and I hadn't written the original screenplay. It's amazing. I know Halloween isn't as big a deal in Ireland as it is here in the States, but on Halloween night, to go to a neighborhood where all the kids are trick-or-treating and probably 10% of them are in Sanderson sisters costumes, you can't help but be moved by that. And it's a dream for any artist to have their work become, in a way, immortalized. And there were a lot of people involved in the making of Hocus Pocus, and it wasn't just because of me that it became what it became. The cast is a huge, important part of it. Kenny Ortega did an amazing job, as a guy who was a choreographer, who became a director, who directed it in a very musical sense. So many things about it. And in fact, I had originally written it about 12-year-olds rather than 16-year-olds because Halloween is a much more integral part of the growing up of a child at the age of 12. The 16-year-olds were always stealing the 12-year-olds' candy. It was a commercial choice on the part of Disney to raise the age. And obviously it was the right choice. So, it's easy to be excited and proud of what came of it, but I'm part of a giant wheel that put that together.
Yeah. And, obviously we got the news that we're going to get to see them again. Over the years, had there been, I've seen a lot of stuff online and a lot of the audience and fans talk about this. Had there been much consideration over the last, 20 years or whatever about revisiting, or was it something that you ever wanted to do or wanted to be involved in? Were you ever reached out to?
They were always, the film was not a very successful film when it first came out. It was another 10, 15 years before it started running on television and on the Disney Channel, ABC, one of the major broadcast networks here. And that started it becoming popular, and it became a perennial then. So in the last 10 years, 15 years, there's been a lot of talk about it. A sequel, a remake, a reboot. For a while, they were going to do a television version with younger versions of the Sanderson sisters. And there were lots and lots of ideas. They never came to me about it. My career kind of changed course and became much more about more adult films, more adult horror, moving away from the Spielberg world of Batteries Not Included and Hocus Pocus, that sort of thing. But for a while, David Kirshner, the producer, and I talked about the possibility of me directing the sequel. But as time went on and there became more and more awareness about diversity, gender equality, and all that, it became clear that this should be a movie written and directed by females. Mm-hmm. And so that's the direction they took. But, in a way, if you've done something momentous, you don't want to step back and try and recapture I'm happy for other people to do it and to get a credit as the creator, one of the creators of the original Hocus Pocus that it's based on. But what if I wrote and or directed the sequel and it was shitty? It would ruin the memory of how fantastic the last many years have been since the movie came out.
Yeah. And jumping to more recent times, maybe about this time last year, I had a chance to chat with one of your good friends and your producer, Joe, and we talked.
Joe Russo.
Yeah, and I had him on the show, and we talked about Nightmare Cinema, and at the time I had said to him, it really felt to me. I always say, and I don't mean it in an insulting way, but I feel like maybe in more modern times, movies and cinema I feel like it's lost that little bit of a spark. There's something I feel that's not quite there, and Nightmare Cinema kind of teleports the audience back to that movie magic feel. And the number one the number one question that I always see people, wondering about that is, why? I know it was a difficult project to kind of get together and finalize and get out there. Yeah. But I see a lot of people afterwards, the feedback was very good, and people want to know, why aren't we? It seems like you still have the formula. Why aren't we getting more? And I guess that's just the greedy audience in a lot of ways.
Well, the movie was very inexpensively made. It had the lowest budget of anything I've ever worked on. Wow. And it was not financially successful. It played in a handful of cinemas. It was very successful in the film festivals where we played. And that was the way to see it on the big screen. But, it's a small movie and it's hard to get attention for small movies. We've been talking about doing a sequel. But the reason it recaptured the magic in the statement was the same reason Masters of Horror did. We gave the filmmakers entire creative control. Do you have a story you want to tell? Do you have a friend who's written a script that you want to direct? Here's a couple of scripts. Are you interested in doing this? But doing it your way. We want it to be your movie. And even though they were, 20-minute movies, they were committed heart and soul to these movies. And that, I think, makes the difference. You can tell when somebody's operating on all cylinders, doing something that they love rather than doing an assignment, you know.
Do you think there's a way we can get back to that?
Sorry?
Do you think there's a way we can get back to that? I know obviously money and studios and all those things kind of take over in a lot of ways, but do you think there's a way that that could be recaptured on a mainstream basis?
I think it can, and I think they're doing it on the streamers. You know, Netflix is doing it. You know, there hasn't been the official announcement yet, but Clive Barker and I are working on an anthology series of all original Clive Barker stories. He's written 10 new stories his way that we will make in the UK. You know, I think it's not going to happen in the theaters. I just think there's no room anymore. But I think broadcast television is too sensitive. You know, what happened with Fear Itself, which was supposed to be the third season of Masters of Horror, it went on broadcast television. And even though it was strong for broadcast television, it still had to be neutered. And there were broadcast standards that had to be met. It wasn't people making their own movies their way. But I think the freedom given to you, whether it's HBO or Netflix, that is a place where it can happen. If you see 30 coins, you'll see how far HBO is willing to go. Or even though it's not a horror series, a series like Euphoria is one of the most extreme in terms of sex and violence of anything I've ever seen on corporate television before. And this is a company owned by Warner Brothers, you know? So I think the hope is in premium and streaming television. And that's how people consume their movies now. You know, a movie like Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho, that was my favorite movie of last year.
Amazing.
Or, you know, Nightmare Alley. The same week, within a week of each other, the Spider-Man movie came out and did 100 times the business of Nightmare Alley or Last Night in Soho. And the more that happens, the less the studios are going to try and put thoughtful, grown-up, unique movies on the big screen. They will sell them off to Netflix and the other streamers. So that's our great hope. And nothing wrong with that, other than missing out on an 80-foot screen, you know, and sharing it with a crowd of 500 people.
Yeah, that's
which
actually
maybe isn't a good idea right now anyway.
That's a good point that you made there, and it's something that kind of like a light bulb going off. That I guess you're right. I see a lot of people giving out right now about you know, the fact that well, I guess more so before the movies actually come out. Things like, you know, we had Scream or Scream 5, or was it a Scream reboot? And it, you know, Halloween, with Blumhouse doing this Halloween trilogy, and a lot of people kind of shit on that for, you know, oh, stop reusing IPs over and over again. But I guess you're right. It's like those things make huge money, and the more often that happens, the more often that's all the studios are going to be willing to do, is go back to those handful of IPs or names. It's
I mean, I find it sad, but thank goodness that the evolution into streaming has taken place at this time, so we still have an outlet for good stuff.
Yeah. Do you have any comfort horror movies? So maybe something that's not seen as like a fantastic movie critic-wise, or, you know, it doesn't have all these awards, but, you know, movies you find yourself revisiting often.
Yeah, I don't watch movies on repeat a whole lot. My wife does. I mean, she's seen Bram Stoker's Dracula probably 50 or 100 times. Wow. Alien, she's probably seen at least as many times. You know, I love Texas Chainsaw 2. Mm-hmm. Speaking of movies with numbers in the title, you know, it's a movie that's not been seen that much, and it's a sequel to a classic, but it's freaking brilliant.
Yeah.
And, you know, speaking of Toby, I can watch Poltergeist over and over and over again. But Cronenberg's Dead Ringers is a movie, you know, you talk about comfort movies. You're not comfortable watching Dead Ringers, but it's a movie that I have seen repeatedly and I never get tired of. You know, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there that it's hard to think of like that. But those are some that I really love. And Rabid, you know, on the Cronenberg train again. I just watched Piranha again, Joe Dante's movie, and you know, that's one of those that just never gets old to me.
Is there anything coming up this year that you're like excited to see, or something that you can't wait to watch?
I'm not really aware of things that are coming up until it gets close and they start promoting them. You know, I look at the websites and you know, listen to podcasts and things like that, and see Fangoria and Rue Morgue and the magazines, and Dread Central, who hosts our podcast. But you know, if I hear of a favorite filmmaker, you know, I just saw yesterday that Coralie Fargia is making a new movie. So that I'm looking forward to, but I'm not really aware of them until it's close to time. But you know, I always have high hopes for good stuff. Yeah.
Obviously, as someone that's had a huge, you know, a long career at this point,
yeah, look how gray my hair is.
It was something I was going to add, and without sounding like too much of a brown noser or an ass kisser, you look really good and really vibrant for your age. Is there something that, and I don't even mean like a you know, a physical thing like working out or anything like that, but what would you attribute? Is it because you, I mean, I guess you followed your dream or your passion? I always find that when someone seems to do something they love, they have this aura about them where they seem alive, a lot more alive than like, I guess, a regular person.
Well, loving what you do is really important. And yeah, I have fulfilled so many dreams, and there are always more that you continue to reach for. But, you know, it does have to do with physical fitness as well, and that sort of thing. You know, I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. I've never smoked a joint. I've never done recreational drugs. I've never had an alcoholic beverage. And I do exercise regularly every day. But, and that's part of, I think, maintaining a clear head as well, you know. And yet, a year ago, I suffered the most deadly kind of heart attack possible, called a widowmaker, that has a 12% survival rate. But only because I have shitty genes. You know, there's heart disease in my family. If I did not live the life I was living, it would have happened a lot longer ago and probably would have been fatal. But you're right. I think the passion for what you do, you know, I would do what I do whether I was paid for it or not. You know, movies would be my hobby if they weren't my job. So I'm lucky enough that they're both, you know, movies and television. And books too. Books is another thing that publishing novels and short stories and things like that is a way to create without thinking about budgets or egos or casting or locations. You know, you write a book and it's entirely of your own devise. There's nothing between you and your audience but the page, whether it's paper or electronic. So doing that as well is incredibly fulfilling. You know, I'll be celebrating my 40th anniversary in May with my wife, and you know, we've shared good times and bad over those days. You know, we really struggled for a while before that call from Steven changed our lives, and we've been able to make a go of it ever since. But you know, having a home that I've lived in for 35 or more years that I love, and work that I'm passionate about, and being healthy enough to be able to hike several miles every day, and have friends in and out of the business that I love. You know, that those are all the things that keep you excited and hopefully exciting. You know? Yeah,
and I feel like that's something that you've been able to cultivate. It's not by mistake or accident. Sometimes people without even having self-awareness about it, I think they look at something like that and go like, you know, oh, that person has all those things. And it's like, well, yeah, I've been the, you know, 25-year overnight success. And I guess probably your passion for life and creation and curiosity probably ties in with the physical side then, because you actually want to keep yourself, you know, you're not in that rut of just, I guess, the everyday whatever, just do the same Groundhog Day. And without getting too in depth with it, when you had your health scare, has that I guess increased your passion, your drive?
Well, let's put it this way. I've created 2 new series and wrote a screenplay in that time. And since that happened, all 3 of them look like they're on track to happening. And I haven't shot anything since Nightmare Cinema 4 or 5 years ago. So, you know, but what it's also done is make me appreciate the relationships that I have with friends and family, and want to make more of them, to be able to spend more time with them, because you don't know. Fortunately, I was only in the hospital 36 hours. I was on the mend very quickly, and I've been at 100% for months. But you never know. Those things come out of nowhere, even when you least expect them. And, you know, you would think I would be one of the last candidates for a massive heart attack. And yet there it was, and it could easily have gone the other way.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it's good to see that you're so healthy and so vibrant. What advice would you give to somebody, you know, whether it be a writer, someone who wants to get into interviewing, podcasting, whatever it might be, someone following their passion? Is there a piece of advice that you would give? Is it just a case of being willing to do it without any financial gain? Or
yeah, I'm glad I don't have to make my living with podcasting, because I would it would not be a pretty picture. But you know, passion is the big deal. And the great news is, with today's technology, you can do a podcast of your own and get it out there. And if it hits with people, you know, and if it doesn't, you can still be out there and doing what you love. I started by interviewing for my high school newspaper and the like, but you also have the tools of filmmaking that I never had. You know, you can shoot a movie beautifully with an iPhone, like Steven Speilberg did with Unsane, and Shane Kelly did with the Florida Project and things like that. You can cut, score, mix an entire movie on your laptop, and it can look really good. Now, getting it seen, that's different. You know, who do you get to cast and that sort of thing. But you can always practice. My way of doing it was by writing. Writing costs you nothing but time. And you just, you know, if that's what you want to do, if you want to do filmmaking, it's, to me, the best way to go about it, unless you can afford to put together a high quality movie that competes with what you see on the big screen or on television. If you're a writer, you can write a script, and all it takes is time. And then you find out agents who are willing to take a look at developing screenwriters. A lot of the bigger agencies don't accept unrepresented material to look at, but there are a bunch that do. And there are sources out there that tell you who those are. But do what you love. Try and fulfill your passion, because now you can do it any place in the globe. You don't have to be born in LA like I was. You can be in Dublin, you can be in Seoul, you can be in Baltimore, and still be vital.
Yeah. I've a couple of more questions before I let you go.
Sure.
I guess for the future, you know, going forward, without, obviously you probably can't talk specifics, What are some of your goals or aspirations going forward? Is there anything that really sticks out that you're like, I really want to make a go at this or that?
Well, there are things that are in the works now that I'm excited about. This thing with Clive is really exciting because it will have all of the power of Masters of Horror, in that it's Clive doing what he wants, the way he wants, and then we'll have filmmakers who share that passion doing it. The movie I've written that has been optioned that we're taking out soon to the studios is not a horror movie. It's got a lot to say. It is something very emotional and something close to my heart. And, I've never had that kind of movie made. I'm not attaching myself to direct it because I want it to be from a different perspective. I want it to be a more diverse kind of story, which is how it's told. Creating a narrative series rather than an anthology series is something I'm in the works on now, where we've got a big star attached to something. I've written the pilot and the first 10 episode outline. Those are things that are thrilling to me, and I always feel like I'm starting anew. I have the nervousness of a first timer every time out because they're all different and the world is constantly changing, and I haven't made a movie in 3 or 4 years. So it's nerve-wracking in the best possible way. So those are things I'm looking forward to. Yeah, doing something that people don't expect from me is something that excites me, and doing something outside of the horror genre. I love it. I have no shame about the horror genre. I embrace it entirely. I'm passionate about it, but just getting the opportunity to work outside of it, because sometimes you're put in genre jail and you can't do anything outside of that genre, even though your skill set may be more inclusive than that. And I would like to think that mine is.
Is there, I guess when I ask this question to people, it's kind of like asking somebody to choose between their kids. Is there a fondest memory you have from your career? Is there anything that sticks out that, you kind of look back on often as like a really fond, like, I feel really good about that? I know you've probably got hundreds of them from the outside looking in, but is there something for you?
But there is one that stands out, and that's that first phone call from Steven Spielberg. I will never forget that. Yeah. It changed my life, not just professionally, but it allowed me to have the kind of life that I could, and I don't mean a movie I could direct, but have more to do with the direction of the course of my life was taking. I could take more control over that after years of experience, but having that affirmation from especially at that time, the greatest filmmaker the world had known and the most successful filmmaker the world had known. And he liked my work enough to want me to work for him, to write for him. That, plus I was on food stamps at the time. I didn't know where my next meal was coming from. I had to sell my wife's car to pay the rent. That phone call is one of the most important things ever to happen to me.
And just to touch on that, you say about food stamps and being in a really bad spot. What would you say was key in those points in your life to, I think a lot of times people get pushed into those situations and just kind of give up. It gets really hard and it's just like, maybe I'll just forget about this and just, work in a grocery store or whatever. What was it that kept you pushing forward?
I'd gotten good response from the things I'd written. People liked it. They just didn't want to make it. I couldn't get to the people. I had an agent at one of the biggest agencies in the business. And the fact that gave me affirmation was part of it. But also, there's a certain bravery in standing out there naked with your art, with what you create, with your creations. And there's a bravery in saying, you know what, I'm going to leave my job doing publicity in order to be able, I've got some money in the bank. I don't know how long it'll last, but I really think that I can do this. And I really think I have a future. Now, if that call had never come, if I were struggling to pay my rent for a year or two after that, I don't know what I would have done. It maybe would have become a hobby. Mm-hmm. And maybe I would have gone back to publicity and doing making of documentaries, which I had been doing before. So it's really hard to say, but it's a kind of bravery, but it can also be seen as a kind of arrogance too. Mm-hmm. That self-belief can be a tricky thing. It can be arrogance, or it can be the passion that helps get you through hard times and helps open doors for you. It's just, personality is an extremely important part of who you are as an artist and as a human being. And you want to be somebody that people want to work with and be around. And that's really an important part of it. And it's also the way I've lived my life non-professionally as well. Even as a kid, it was important. My parents fought a lot and eventually broke up when I was about 12. The band would fight sometimes, and I was always that bridge over troubled water, mm-hmm. It was important. Harmony was important to me, and you find that incredibly valuable when you're directing on a film set.
Yeah, I would imagine. It's great to hear you talk so candidly and so open about some of that stuff, because I think, at least for my audience, I think a lot of times it's seen as, they look at somebody like you as a hero or someone they look up to or they're inspired by, and they find it really hard to think you also deal with those situations. You also had a terrible health scare and probably had all these crazy thoughts and emotions, and maybe at times, like you said about the nerves, and even still now, I think people would find that hard to believe that, Mick Garris, who's done all these things, still gets nervous when he goes into something new, or still has that bit of, tension, nervous energy.
Well, fear is a great motivating factor to doing good work.
Yeah.
When you feel you have something to prove, it makes you work harder.
Yeah. Do you have an unpopular horror opinion?
I'm sure I do, but you've caught me off guard. Well, it won't be a negative opinion of something everybody else loves and I don't, because I don't do that. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question, but one I wasn't prepared for, so I don't know how to answer that.
I would say I don't agree, but there's probably a big portion of people that would say something like you enjoying Texas Chainsaw 2 as much as you do, which I also do. Sometimes I get flack for that, where people are like, really? Why? It's terrible, and it's, the first one is such a classic. You can't like it.
It's hilarious. Yeah. It's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, that is definitely an unpopular opinion, but yeah, I don't mind extremity. I embrace it if it's done intelligently. Mm-hmm. Just stuff splattered against the screen for the sake of the splatter it's fine, it's fun, but it becomes tiresome for me, and which is why I don't embrace the franchise movies so much, because they do go back to the well time and time again, or films that are just about shock. I hate maltreatment of animals in movies. This isn't a genre film, but Year of the Dog, mm-hmm. the Netflix movie, I couldn't finish watching it because for our entertainment, they geld bulls, Benedict Cumberbatch proudly talks about learning how to geld a bull so he could do it on camera. And he beats a horse with his hands in this movie. And it's like, treating animals like that in a movie for our entertainment, to me, should be against the law. And I believe it is, but somehow, maybe not in Australia. But yeah, I hate the use, and certainly Sleepwalkers was our cat movie and things like that. But I really hate, even in movies now, at this point, do we need cat scares? Do we need a cat suddenly jumping out of somewhere, or starting a movie? If you see a dog, it's going to die in the movie, no matter what. Hitting a deer when you're on a road trip, and that's the beginning of the horror story. Enough with the killing of animals to get the motor going. That it may not be a popular opinion, but it's mine.
Yeah, now that you say that, there's so many things that were popping into my head as you were talking there. I was like, yeah, I can think of probably hundreds of movies now that use that trope, I guess, if that's what you call it.
When it was newer, that's one thing, but now it's been done so often. And an animal's going to die at the beginning out of 10 every 10 horror movies, it seems like. And it's just like enough already.
Yeah. I really appreciate your time today. It's been a true honor to actually get to chat
fun
with you and see you in person. You look great. Is there
totally my pleasure.
Where can people find you, or where would you like people to? There's probably nothing you can talk about right now, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, if you follow the Postmortem with Mick Garris podcast, you pretty much are up to date on things as they happen. I do have a website of all the interviews called Mick Garris Interviews. It has my old Z Channel interviews on them. It has the Postmortem TV show from 2010 on it, where we have William Friedkin and Rick Baker and, John Landis, John Carpenter, Toby Hooper, all of those people in television interviews. And it's got some of my audio books of some of my short stories read by myself, by Steven Weber, Miguel Ferrer, Matt Frewer. You can check out on Amazon. I've got several books that I've written and published that are there, and very few people know about the publishing side of my work, but I'm all around. But the podcast is probably the best place to get the updated news.
Yeah. So for anybody listening, the links to all of Mick's stuff will be in the description wherever you're listening to the podcast. For his own podcast, books, everything will be down below in the description wherever you're listening to this. So I have a final question before I let you go. And it's, why horror, and what does it mean to you?
It's a great question, and everybody's answer is different. But for me, I was a pretty lonely kid. I didn't have a lot of close friends when I was small. I always felt like an outsider. My parents fought a lot. I wasn't close with my siblings until later in life. And it was a comfort blanket to me. It was something that it was movies about outsiders, whether it was Frankenstein's monster or Abbott and Costello. It was, I identified more with the monsters than with the heroes. But it was the outre and something different from what everybody else was into, and something you could embrace that felt like your own. Reading Famous Monsters as a kid, watching those old movies on Channel 11 on Saturday afternoon, whether they were good or bad. Nobody else I knew was doing that, but it just gave me great comfort and inspiration. I started writing horror stories more than anything else because that's what my background was. And my mother encouraged it. And my father was an artist. And so that was the one thing he and I had in common before they split up. So, it was kind of a security blanket at a very insecure time of my life.
Yeah, I definitely, and that's why I feel like it's in a lot of ways maybe a vague kind of broad question to ask someone, but I always like to hear how different the answers always end up being.
Yeah, and there's a great documentary called Why Horror by Tal Zimmerman.
I actually had him on the show a couple of weeks back.
He's a great guy. I met him at one of the festivals. And And the whole documentary shows how it's impossible to answer that question.
Because I asked him that question at the end of the podcast, and we kind of ascertained that there is no real one answer. Like I said, Mick, it's been an absolute pleasure. I hope we can do it again when you have maybe some more stuff that you can actually talk about. We'll keep our fingers crossed that everything goes well.
All right. I'm looking forward to it, Aaron. Take care.
And like I said, take care. You look great, and I wish you all the best.
So do you, Aaron.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
all the
Mick.
best.
Evil wears many masks, but pure horror wears only one. Support First Class Horror on Patreon for as little as $1. Can't get enough of the horror? Carve yourself a deal from official merchandise, only on Teespring. Join us on all social media at First Class Horror. We have such sights to show you.